Major funding for these broadcasts has been provided by grants from New York Community Bank, M&T Bank, PBM, Customers Bank, Collins Building Services, AmTrust Title Insurance Company, Marks Paneth, Capital One Bank. Additional funding for these broadcasts has been provided by grants from Amerant Bank, Bank of America, Citizens Bank, Dime Community Bank, Douglaston Development Levine Builders, Flushing Bank, Friedman LLP, Handro Properties LLC Handler Real Estate Organization, Hodges Ward Elliott Inc., Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, John Catsimatidis Red Apple Group, Keysight Capital Partners, New Banks, Meridian Capital Group, Ocean First Bank, People's United Bank, RPW Group, TD Bank, and these friends. Oh boy, what's happening? Close to 70% of New Yorkers have been vaccinated. There's questions of when people are going to return to work. It looks like by September, there's going to be a significant number of people returning to work. What's happening in the residential market? What's happening in the condo market? Bioscience, industrial, all these topics are important topics. So today, with the help of my executive producer, Andrea, I put together a group of individuals to talk about creative solutions in the post-pandemic world. My guests include Samantha Rudin Earls, Executive Vice President of Rudin Management, Brian Wu, who is the Vice President of Acquisitions and a principal at Young Wu and Associates, Michael Rudin, Executive Vice President recently at Rudin Management, and last but not least, my favorite executive producer and co-host of the show today, Andrea Himmel, who's Director of Acquisitions at Himmel Merengraph. So, Andrea, you brought the people together. Tell me what's going on. Where do you see the world? Are we in a much better position today? It's June.
June is a blessing. And speaking of Broadway, I just was a guest with Samantha at the Roundabout Gala. So talk about the comeback of New York City. I work at Himmel and Merengoff Properties. We're a long-term oriented, vertically integrated firm that was founded 40 years ago. We own a portfolio of office buildings in Manhattan and industrial warehouses in the boroughs. We also have some life sciences. What's happening? I mean, I have to say, I've gone to a Broadway show, Blindness, Knicks game, leasing activity is up. People are in the street. Traffic is back. I love the sound of honking now. So it feels like the energy is coming back, although it does feel, on the other hand, like we're going to have to wait until Labor Day for people to return fully to their offices. We've been back since June, but and we like to think that a lot of the industry is back, but other industries, law firms, banking, et cetera, they may take some time to come back. But it feels like spring is in the air, and we're suddenly starting to open again.
When it comes to office, the leading people around the office world is Rudin, okay? Founded many years ago by your great-grandfather, okay? The company is a wonderful company, and you're on the pulse. So tell me what percentage of people are back to work in the office, because you have statistics on that.
Sure. Well, thanks for having us today, Michael, and thank you, Andrea, for inviting us to be on with this group. The last 3 weeks, it's really been fascinating to see the speed at which things have turned around. I would say even as recently as early May, the thought was end of the summer, as Andrea said, maybe even end of this year for most people to start coming back. And then, just like someone flipping a light switch in the middle of May, everybody started changing their plans and their return to work schedule. And we're seeing many companies, either push up to sometime in June or right after 4th of July, obviously is a couple weeks away now, or even Labor Day, who might have been saying, end of 21 or beginning of 22. So, there's no one size fits all answer, obviously. The occupancy that we're seeing across our portfolio, it really varies from building to building, but it's creeping up into the upper 20s and lower 30%, sort of, I'd say, on average. Whereas, even a month or 6 weeks ago, it was in maybe the mid to high teens. So we're seeing, really meaningful changes, as Andrea mentioned. You look around the city, whether it's events or traffic or outdoor dining or just people on the street, the city is really turned a corner in the last couple of weeks, and that's really, really great to see.
In terms of office, we own smaller buildings in the Rudens, and we've actually seen small tenants come back more quickly, just because they don't have these like legal systems imposing requirements as to when you can demand your employees to come back. And even in our co-working space, we're seeing higher occupancy than on average.
Yeah.
Brian, what are you seeing? You have unique properties and you're in development, the radio tower building and some of the other projects, Pier 57.
Sure. Similar to what Andrea was saying, we own smaller office buildings, so what we're seeing for the most part is those tenants don't have to go through, sort of a legal bureaucracy to be able to make an election to come back. I think our office is probably a great example of that. We've been back in some sort of capacity since June of last year, really since, phase 2 that they called that opened up. Not everybody back 100%, of course, but I've been personally walking back to the office for about a year. It's slowly turning. And I think if you hear what people are talking about, the expectations of now going past Labor Day, I think it's going to accelerate. We're going to have a little bit of a normalization. But I will say, the people who are thinking that it's going to go back to 100% of what it was pre-pandemic, probably not true. Like, I think that the death of New York City has been completely overstated, right? But the truth is going to be a little bit in between. I think that there is going to be a contingent of people who continue to work from home, but the demand of office space is going to continue to be strong, and people are going to come back. But we're not going to get back to 100% of pre-pandemic occupancy, I think.
Well, if I could just step in, because, I just think it's profound, a year ago now where we were, and, our father likes to say, don't bet against New York. And I mean, a year ago now, you literally, you would just, stop in your tracks and to walk through our buildings and see them empty. And we were having weekly conversations with residential about, people trying to break their leases and rent reductions. And yesterday, I'm happy to say that we hit our 88% occupancy mark, and we're just each week, averaging 50 tours a week. And we're seeing, as Andrea said, the momentum and the rate of the return is also very, I think, exciting and in a way surprising. And if you track in terms of the vaccine rollout, the confidence and just people returning, whether it's the offices or, on the residential side, you can feel it. And we're going through our inventory now to the point where we're like, we have to turn our apartments even faster to meet, the demand. So it's exciting. Again, it's very different than where we were a year ago now. So I feel
Here's a question for all of you, whoever wants to chime in on it. Is it a tenant's opportunity, both in the office tenant and in the residential tenant today, to get a better deal? Not as good as a year ago, but can you still get a good deal today if you want to sign a lease?
I'll chime in on the office side. What we're seeing is the larger tenants are looking to be sort of opportunistic and take advantage of the ability to do long-term leases at what are reduced rates. The smaller tenants are kind of kicking the can down the road, doing blend and extend and figuring out what their business will look like over the next year to 2 years. What this pandemic has taught us is that we have to figure out a way to reimagine space and reposition it. And so while the traditional office tenants that may have occupied space may not be back in full, to Brian's point, we are seeing creative uses, really evolve. So whether it's, I know you did a panel earlier on cannabis, or there's a few in the retail space, these companies called GoPuff and Gorilla, which each have a few $100 million of funding, and they do 10-minute delivery of convenience store items. So we're really seeing a reimagination of space and how it's being utilized.
With regard to that, Rudin Management is doing a repositioning on your office properties, okay? 3 Times Square and other properties you're working on that. Tell me a little bit about what you're doing today.
Pre-pandemic, we had a significant amount of roll coming at 2 properties, in particular 80 Pine Street down in the financial district and 3 Times Square. And like I said, we knew those tenants were going to be vacating, COVID or not. So we had put in motion significant repositioning plans for both of those assets. 80 Pine Street is 60 years old, so it's obviously a different animal than 3 Times Square, which is only 20 years old. But in both cases, we realized, we need to modernize these buildings in various ways and really change, change the offering and particularly the amenities to be able to attract the next crop of tenants for these buildings. Between the 2 assets, we're investing close to $500 million in terms of these repositioning programs. They're really kind of the same when you look at the 2 buildings. It's refresh of the lobby, it's new elevator cabs, and then it's amenity spaces and creating a place and a space for tenants to get outside of their 4 walls and really go somewhere else in the building, either for a meeting, for a snack, for a meal, maybe even a workout or a conference or a lecture of some sort. And we're really seeing, in our portfolio elsewhere, as well as across the market, that these types of spaces are really, really what today's tenants are looking for in terms of the next.
You were involved with WeWork at the beginning. Now you're involved with Industrious. What's your thoughts as owners of buildings with regard to co-working and co-sharing?
Listen, the last 10 years sort of in the flex office space has been quite an interesting one to watch. We have two large projects with WeWork. But even before WeWork, we had a number of these flex office providers throughout our portfolio. I think watching the last year has certainly been interesting. There's obviously pre-pandemic, everything that WeWork went through, and then everybody kind of refocusing and working through the last year. I personally think the next 12, 24, maybe even 36 months will be an incredibly active time for these flex office providers, the ones who have, persevered through the last year. Kind of to Andrea's point before, companies large, small, single person, 1,000 people, doesn't really matter. Nobody really knows what their office of the future is going to look like right now. Sure, there's a lot of people are starting to make bets, people are starting to sign long-term leases, but I think you're going to see a lot, kind of put things on hold or want greater flexibility in the near term until there's more understanding and there's more, sort of knowledge of what the office of the future is going to be like. So to that end, I think, the flex providers are going to be very busy over the next couple of years.
By the way, Michael, 99% of businesses in New York City are technically small businesses. 44% of employees work for small businesses. So, and a lot of people have we saw it in our own portfolio, have terminated their existing leases, but continued the business. So I think there are a lot of people who are looking to co-working spaces saying this is the right fit because it has the right, flex term and just, physical accommodations that are conducive for a company that's kind of in growth mode or I don't know where I'll be mode. But in our own portfolio, we work at one of the WeWorks that we have that's a full building is already at almost 50% occupancy, whereas, the city is anywhere between 15 and 30%. So, it's a great time to be starting in co-working, although, we saw it poorly executed and poorly capitalized before. I think it's actually an interesting time to be in that market.
So Hulu documentaries and headline risk aside, right, it's clear that flex office space is not going anywhere. And I think what's been really interesting over the past year and clearly was a trend going forward, what is the fact that there's been a little bit of a blending between different asset classes, right? So, if you look at what residential is trying to incorporate into that, is the idea that you have to put some sort of amenity that's going to allow people to work in residential. Within offices, you have to put more amenities like Michael and Sam are doing in terms of allowing office tenants to feel like there's more of like a homely feel to it. Even you can make the argument that industrial and retail, that they're clearly intertwined, and a lot of this e-commerce stuff is really an offshoot of the retail operation. It's like the brick and mortar space in Soho. So, I think the name of the game, like looking forward and trying to figure out what is going to be a creative solution to the post-pandemic world is how do you look, sort of a little bit more dynamically at these asset classes, and how do you create a product that is flexible? Because flexibility is really going to be the key. If you could basically build something or create something where people feel like there's a multitude of different uses within that asset, I think that's going to have more longevity than necessarily just creating one single thing and thinking that that's going to survive.
I agree completely. And I think, as Michael said, it's anyone's guess what the future is. But one of the things that I do think, and this sort of came to me, is, we talk about the flight to quality. And, I thought last night, it's also, it's almost the flight to quality of life as well. And people in the pandemic, I think, have learned, if the pendulum went from one extreme of everyone always hustling and being at the office and, every day, that work grind, and then going in the opposite direction of, being more at home and trying to figure out how to bring it back into a state of balance. And I think people want to improve on their quality of life and living experience and working experience, and the merging of the two. So in work, in office and commercial, finding the opportunities where people can, and we were already going in this direction and reinvesting, as Michael said, in our, in our buildings and lobbies and amenities, but it's even more, I think, accentuated now in terms of whether it's, outdoor spaces, air quality, wellness opportunities, healthy food options. So I think it's pushing us even farther in a direction that we were already sort of heading in.
By the way, there's an article in last week's Economist about how we kind of don't pay enough attention to the quality of air in buildings. And there's a global study across, dozens of countries that showed that both in educational environments and in office environments, people are about 60% more productive where the air is much cleaner and more fresh. So I think, that's something that'll become more and more important over time.
To step back and not just think about, the buildings, but it's the people in them and the environment around and everything. Again, we could be fully leased and occupied, but if the planet is not doing well, it's long term, it's not going to really mean much. So taking a step back and really, taking a more corporate responsibility outlook and looking around us and making sure that we're doing everything to preserve our lives and world and planet. So it's a different
Brian,
perspective.
tell us what Young Will is doing these days.
We are trying to stay ahead a little bit ahead of the curve, I would say. I think that our thesis fundamentally is that we think there's going to be a little bit more of a decentralization in the urban areas. I'm not talking about like New York going down or anything like that and buy a bunch of houses in like Hudson Valley. It's that the outer boroughs, I think, are due for a little bit of a lift. And I think that if you're investing in the outer boroughs in a way where you're being creative about the asset class, I think that's a long-term solution to some of the things that we're talking about right now.
And I think all of you are investing in the outer boroughs. Rudin, is with Dock 72. Andrea, with the ABC Carpet, the properties up in the Bronx. Brian, you with Upper Manhattan and the Bronx. A return to New York, I think you have to have tourists back. You have to have hotels. When are we going to see this conversion from hotel to residential? What's your forecast about that? Anybody want to pose that question?
I was going to say, we've been looking a lot at retail in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and with associated land plays, where the upside is either to build a hotel or, hope for a ULURP where you can get some resi for primarily industrially zoned, commercially zoned properties and sites. And, it seems like we've tried before to convert hotel to office. It's a lot more capital intensive than people think, from the plumbing and HVAC and all the other, mechanical systems perspectives. But I also know a lot of folks, and including myself, who looked at hotel debt, and that opportunity has sort of disappeared as the market's gotten saturated with debt investors. But it does feel like hotels are returning, and we will see downtown, at least, some of the rezonings that have been proposed probably come to fruition. So Soho, for example, NoHo, Gowanus, et cetera.
Most of you have retail tenants, what are you providing to the tenants to make sure that they remain there? Is it percentage rents? Is it fixed rents? Where do we see that today?
Retail is not a huge portion of our business or portfolio. We do have a number of spaces in the ground floor of our buildings. And again, there's not a one size fits all solution or answer. We certainly over the past year have been trying to work with the tenants who have come to us to say they need help, rent deferments, abatements, whatever it is. Obviously, we'd rather keep them in the space and hope to live to fight another day than to have them hand back the keys because they couldn't make it because they couldn't pay rent. So we're working with people. We're looking at new deals. Andrea mentioned this sort of new concept of kind of delivery on demand with GoPuff and Gorillas. There are companies out there who are jumping on the opportunity that has presented itself over the last year of new access to spaces that they may have never had access to before, or at rents that they might not have ever thought were possible. So there is on that side of the business as well, at least that we're seeing and hearing a kind of resurgence of retail in certain ways, new restaurants opening. It's happening. It's just it's a little slow.
One area that there's limited amount of space available is life science and bioscience. Where do you see that growing? Is Rudin Management getting involved with it? Is Brian, you getting involved? Andrea?
We own a property on West 57th between 10th and 11th that has 200,000 square feet available for life science space. The building is proved to be a campus already, as it has existing life science tenants already. The space that was vacated was formerly utilized by CVS. We're marketing it for life sciences because it's M-zoned. It's got the appropriate building systems, infrastructure, floor loads, freight, et cetera, that are required of life sciences in order to accommodate those needs. I think one thing that's important, New York City's life science space is only 2.5 million square feet. It'll double in the next few years, but the reason that we haven't seen this space evolve to the extent that Cambridge or parts of California have seen it is New York doesn't have a graduation space market. So historically, pharmaceutical companies would grow through internal R&D and spend their capex that way. Now, however, they tend to buy the pipelines of startup companies. So startup companies tend to start like at a place like Alexandria, where they have 1,000 square feet or less. They like to cluster, and when they get an FDA approval or a round of venture funding, they have an immediate need for new space. So we're pre-building our floors 15,000 square feet at a time because there's no graduation market in New York City. So you have the hospital-sized tenants that are 200,000 square foot needs, and then you've got the 1,000 square foot startups, but there's really not that 5,000 to 20,000 square foot space market in the life science area. So, and what happens when life science tenants get an FDA approval, they're then given a set of dates that they have to meet in order to get certain milestones hit for the final approval. So they don't care if they're paying $70 a foot or 120. If they're not in their space, forget it. I will add, however, it's very expensive to build out, $400 a foot. So are you making a bet on a 3-year life science company that is a startup and you don't know about its pipeline? Or can you get conviction in the venture behind it? Or do you want to make a bet on an incubation facility like J Labs or some of the other ones?
before we finish, I want to bring up the subject of prop tech, which I know that the Rudins have been very involved with in Rudin Ventures. Talk to me about prop tech and if we can quickly about the subject of SPACs.
Well, I think you could do a whole episode on SPACs. The last, I don't know, 6 to 12 months, whatever it's been, where SPACs have really, taken off, has created a lot of equity and value for a lot of investors and a lot of startups. And I think the prop tech space in general is really firing across the board, across all sort of asset classes. And if you asked a lot of these companies in March or April or May of 2020 what their outlook was, it was probably pretty bleak given COVID. And I think a lot of them in the prop tech space have figured out a way either to pivot or to to sort of reimagine themselves or create a new product or offering to complement whatever they were doing before. It's a great time, convergence of real estate and technology, and there are a lot of really great companies out there doing some really exciting stuff.
You're also seeing serious landlords considering taking single buildings public.
I'm very fortunate that Andrea put together all of her friends for a very interesting show. I'd like to thank Sam, Brian, Michael, and needless to say, Andrea. See you next week, and I promise to have you back in September. Take care, enjoy. Thanks again.
Thanks, Michael.